Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another session of the Pursuit Power Half Hour. I'm Brent, and I'm here with Tom Rodenhouser from Kennedy Intelligence. If you listen to the podcast either regularly or semi-regularly, Tom's been on several times and brings sharp insights into the world of management consulting. Today, we're diving into what he's seeing and observing inside consulting firms, namely how the most successful firms are operationalizing AI across roles and workflows, how boutique firms in particular are learning from the global players, and what the next generation of top consultants looks like. Tom, it's great to have you on this new format, and welcome back.
Thanks, Brent. Love being here.
Of course, AI is on the top of mind for everyone in consulting, both building capability to provide to their clients as well as kind of turning that lens inward a bit. When we talked prior to our planning for this chat, you said you're seeing boutique firms borrow plays from the global giants to operationalize AI. Give us and our listeners a little bit more insight into that. What are the most effective strategies you think firms are adopting right now, and what's working? What are you observing that make these approaches work?
First, to set some context, I think we cover the broadest range of providers. So when we talk about the global firms, there's a lot of headlines about what they're doing with AI. I think, in the big picture, what they're really doing is putting their arms around their collective knowledge, using AI as the tool. I think boutiques are doing the same thing. And so they're borrowing the idea of what's our collective knowledge, how can we access it effectively and efficiently, and then also how can we reach beyond, our work and extend into the rest of the knowledge base. It's almost like it evens the playing field in a sense. And I know there's been a lot written about how small firms and boutiques compete against big firms. That's always been the case. It's not David versus Goliath here. But I think this truly unlocks potential for boutiques to be much more effective vis-a-vis how a big firm operates. Best example I've seen is a boutique that basically is able to put together a knowledge, not even a deck, but a knowledge base that's comparable with what you might see at, one of the large global players. And so in the eyes of the client, they kind of say, well, they have the same domain expertise as what, a larger firm might have.
Right. And we've seen examples. There's, plenty of press in the business press around folks like McKinsey and their private LLM, and then training on, 50 plus years of client insights. So I think one of the things around AI is that it is accessible. You don't need to build, for instance, your own data center or invest in a ton of CapEx to take part in that. So what you're saying, it sounds like, is you're seeing boutiques essentially replicate or put their own twist on this, where they're building a corpus of knowledge, both internally, gleaning from outside sources to deploy on behalf of clients.
Yeah. And what AI does is it really connects strategy and execution. A lot of knowledge, we use that term, it's applied to strategies, what you should do. What AI does is it brings that down. It makes strategic insights kind of a baseline, not the top line. And as a result, there's much more focus on executing the strategy. So this is what I mean about a boutique being able to operate much more like a big firm. They can provide strategic insights that could be on par with a larger firm. And ideally, what they can then do is really focus on the execution, because that's where ultimately this is headed. It's how you execute the strategy, not the strategy itself.
As AI gains more adoption in the consulting space, and I think in this context, we're talking about boutique firms, smaller firms, using AI internally to accelerate their work. right? I think when AI burst onto the scene in a real way, a lot of the larger firms were generating tons of revenue deploying AI on behalf of clients, maybe building data lakes that could then be, trained with an LLM model, doing training, whatever the case might be. But this is really about turning inward. And as you see AI reshaping work, style work, tempo, accelerating it, and in the roles, what do you think that next generation of top performing talent and consultants look like? What, you know, what are the skills, the traits, for that junior analyst kind of embarking in their career in consulting all the way up to sort of the mid to upper tiers? What behaviors are firms looking for or should be hiring and developing as they scale their talent?
Well, let me answer that by talking a bit about how AI is being deployed inside the firms. What we're seeing is it's being used to enhance workflows, especially on the resource side. So, for example, the agentic AI pieces that are being built into PSAs, the resource planning tools,
Mm-hmm.
very effective. It's allowing firms to put together teams and kind of allocate resources in a much, much more efficient way. Now, what that does is it allows a firm to really identify, A, B, C. We always talk about how teams are put together that way. It's the A players. You can put together these teams in ways that are very effective for the client. That being said, what's happening with the actual talent front is quite interesting because the headlines are saying, well, that whole bottom layer of the pyramid, the junior analyst,
Mm-hmm.
the entry level, is either going to be diminished or go away. I'm of the mind, and from talking with firms, what seems to be happening is there's an element of the rote work that is going away. And that's what AI is very effective at, that kind of binary yes, no, putting together the data and saying, here it is. It makes the human element, kind of the checking part, that much more important. And so what's happening is these junior analysts are being elevated into roles where they're essentially checking what AI is producing. And it's a different skill set, but it's also the type of skill set that you would see from someone who's come into the firm, worked a couple to 3 years, and then they're elevated into that role. They're coming into that role almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's required there are folks who, obviously AI is a tool, so knowing how to use the tool and understand the tool, but recognize that it is a tool and it's not the answer. And I've seen and heard about many cases where someone uses it to take the shortcut, and then the shortcut leads them in a client situation to a dead end. So I think the skill set is going to be much more of the same types of ability to think strategically, to think about use cases and application of problem solving and how to solve problems, but it's just going to be accelerated. You won't have that learning curve is going to be, measured in weeks and months rather than years.
No, that's great insight. And that idea of being able to think critically and strategically and having that contextual taste, discernment, and knowledge to really double check, refine, and enhance those outputs. But as you brought up, a lot of rote work can now be done and actually really accelerate client outcomes faster. The business press, the trades are awash in a sea of great ideas on how firms are using AI and everything from, reducing the headcount because it's taking the place of kind of interns and junior level analysts, all the way through like really, really accelerated insights on behalf of clients, very exotic use cases and so forth. But before a firm can do really anything and scale AI and use it internally to accelerate outcomes for their clients. What are the building blocks? What are the foundational elements you're seeing, the patterns of data process, governance, right? Keeping client IP safe, and the culture to utilize AI. What are the patterns you're seeing in the mid-size firms that are ascending that have to be in place? What's if you were building, for instance, a non-negotiable checklist for operationalizing it? What are the things that firms should consider and are really imperatives?
Well, I'll tell you, you used the key word governance. I think the first building block is governance. How are you going to use it? Not what are you going to use, because there's plenty of tools out there to use. It's how you're going to use it, where you're going to use it, and why you're going to use it. And when you answer those questions in a governance structure, you point the direction of the firm in terms of how you're going to use this tool. And I give an example where I was talking with a boutique firm, and they said the first thing they did was they developed a governance structure for AI before they actually started using AI. And what that allowed them to do was to identify certain areas. For example, they work in some highly regulated industries where you're not allowed to use AI. They work on their clients' platforms. So they had to put in the governance structure that said, when we're on their platforms, these are the cases where we cannot use AI. And then the other part of governance is transparency. So when you're working with clients, you tell them we're using AI. This is where we're using it. This is how we're using it. You allow the client full visibility into the tool that you're using. There's no, it's not a magic wand. And I think, consulting has always had this mystique where, what do they do? How do they do it? They kind of go off, rub their sticks together, and they come back with a solution. AI is a very transparent tool. And I think what clients have recognized is that firms that are transparent with the tools that they're using are indeed the trusted, that's part of the trusted relationship. So, I keep going back to governance as kind of a guiding document. And then when you get into the actual tools themselves, most of them are being applied internally. So to HR processes, to make hiring and screening more effective, to make communication within the team and across teams much more efficient and consistent. So those types of tools to make the culture of the firm and enhance the culture of the firm, I think that's where the what you do with it is being applied most right now. We're seeing more and more kind of, if you think about AI as 1.0, we're in AI 1.0 for the consulting industry. The 2.0 is going to be the deployment, like what the consultants are actually deploying to their clients using AI and building agentic AI, building the bots, things like that. And this is where I think it's going to be getting really interesting, because the stress, and I've talked about this before with you and other places, about how the commercial model for consulting is going to change. Because the more you're changing the time factor and the resource factor, you have to move much more directly to outcome-based billing. And I think, and this goes back to the types of people, like what kind of resources you're bringing in. They're going to have to be very outcome-focused. I mentioned execution. The idea that you're going to bill by the hour is going to go by the wayside very, very rapidly. And I think the types of skills, the types of people that you're bringing into your organization have to be so laser focused on the outcome. And that will separate kind of the good consultants from the ones that are just sort of trying to adapt the old model to a new world.
So that dovetails nicely into a question I had teed up around, it all comes down to pricing, clients, procurement, grinding and negotiating the fungible billable hour down to a lower for on behalf of the client. So when you hit that buzzsaw of procurement or negotiation, clients, of course, are asking tough questions. We saw this several years ago when AI really burst onto the scene in the marketing services segment, for instance. Communications firms that are building assets on behalf of clients for their marketing deployments and going to their firms and saying, can 20% of this, can 30% of this be done through AI? And hence you're reducing kind of your staff and headcount need. And if you're based on an hourly fee structure, then it's 20% of your revenue could go away. So what kind of questions are you seeing clients ask of the firms? Maybe governance, maybe price, and how do you counsel firms to talk transparently to clients about the use of AI in the work that they're going to transact?
What's interesting about that is, unlike previous tools that were that became available to the consultants, AI is sort of this democratic kind of concept where clients are using it, consultants are using it. Everyone's using AI, and they're all thinking about the potential for what it can do. The problem is AI it's not a use case tool. You can use an AI solution and it solves a problem. But what it does is it effectively and fundamentally changes the whole process. It's not about doing it more efficiently. It just totally blows it up if it's taken to its extreme. And so I think what's happening, this gets back to the transparency issue. What we're seeing with firms is they don't necessarily know what they're unleashing when they go after some of these solutions, because change management, that's always been an afterthought in consulting. It's kind of like you go solve the problem, solve the use case with either a technology or a solution, process improvement. And then you kind of figure out how to change management piece. You kind of figure that out after the fact. This has to be part and parcel to the whole concept, because, and I'll give an example. We were with a firm and they were doing they're building agentic AI, or using agentic AI to change an insurance claims process. And it wasn't about making that process more efficient. It was about removing the layers and fundamentally making it machine to machine, kind of a machine to machine process with human intervention over here. And what that did was it fundamentally changed the entire workforce that was tasked with those processes. It fundamentally changed how the process was working. Yes, much more efficient. But what it unleashed was this kind of, okay, what do we do now? And a lot of this talk about, you redeploy people to do different things. You have to think about what those different things are before you unleash the genie. And I think, from our standpoint, this is why the outcome-based piece is going to be so important. You have to really, if you're going to tie your fees to outcomes, which is, we know this is where this is going, you have to be darn sure of what those outcomes are going to be, not only to get paid, but also fundamentally, how is that client going to come back to you if you can't guarantee what those outcomes are? I don't know if that helps explain kind of the context of this, but I think the measurability factor, this is something that consultants and clients have talked for years and years about: success-based billing, about taking risks, skin in the game, all the cliches. And what we find is that it's all talk, because when you get to the point of actually negotiating and saying, okay, if we do X, it's going to create Y, and then we get paid. And if you don't know what that equation is, you're really back to this time and materials thing. And that's just not the way of the world going forward. So, we think the measurability piece is going to be so fundamental. And I think as consultants learn what AI can do, they'll get better at aligning it to the outcomes. But this goes back to my point about everybody's learning together here. And I think this is where clients will value the consultants who are transparent about being on the journey with AI along with their client.
The idea here around utilizing AI, both on behalf, operationally within the firm, and then on behalf of client outcomes, and not simply building and executing AI strategy on behalf of clients, but using AI, to drive outcomes for them, sort of is a little bit in conflict, I think, with another facet of kind of very topical business news around this idea of, is there an AI bubble? Has there been overinvestment? And I think in that context, there's quite a bit of talk around kind of the investment in the infrastructure required, computing power, data centers, chips, that type of thing. And there's probably some truth to that. And there's been some really interesting analysis between that and, building fiber capacity in the United States and the run up to the dot-com bubble and all those types of things. But is there a hype gap between what's possible in driving outcomes for clients and realistic deployment? How much AI velocity can a firm expect to drive on behalf of clients? And do you have any examples in conversing with firms and seeing and observing what they're doing that they've been able to articulate maybe that romance and reality, or what's feasible and what's realistic? Anything kind of come to mind in some of the firms you've been counseling?
Yeah, there is definitely a hype bubble in terms of the promise of AI, and we've seen this before in certain cycles where kind of the consultants latch on to something and it's going to change everything. The hype, the size of that bubble, I think, is smaller. It's not. It's more real in terms of what AI potentially can do. What we find interesting, and this is talking with both clients and with firms, is we think AI, normally consultants drive change from either the top down or the middle in. And by that, I mean, you're working with senior executives on the client side, you devise a strategy, that gets pushed down into the organization to then be executed, whether by consultants or internally, or you have consultants who work at the middle, kind of line of business, SVP levels, doing use case problem solving, and that drives change. With AI, what's actually happening is you have sets of firms that are trying to drive AI from the top down, basically telling the client through the C level, this is what you're going to do with AI, and we're going to push it down to the organization. We also see AI coming from the bottom up, and this is where the platform companies, the more technical, the Accentures of the world, for example, and even technical boutiques, they're coming in and kind of pushing up through the organization AI solutions. And what's happening is there's essentially two schools of thought. The consultants who drive change from the top historically have not been execution oriented. The ones who drive from the middle and bottom don't have access to the top leadership, and therefore the execution is disconnected from a strategy. You're just kind of whacking the mole. AI is bringing this together, and it goes back to my point about kind of unleashing change. And what we're seeing is that you're going to have firms that really will drive change from the bottom. They'll drive change from the bottom of the organization and through the organization, through the use of AI. And then there's going to be a layer of consultants who are going to come in and manage that change. What we think is going to happen is change management, which has always been a throwaway line, is actually going to move to the forefront. Because at a fundamental level, and this, it reveals my age and how long I've been in this industry. But anyone who read Jim Champy's book, about BPR, re-engineering the corporation, this is re-engineering. This is what's happening, but it's for real. It's not hypothetical. And it's AI that's going to re-engineer these companies. And then the consultants have to manage and hopefully help their clients manage the impact of all that.
That's a good highlight and book to reference as well, because that was a bit of an epoch, right? And we're kind of heading into
it ushered in the modern era of consulting.
We should make a note of that in the show notes. We're seeing firms deploy this. You're seeing medium-sized ascendant consulting firms having some success, testing, failing, refining, going on the journey with clients together. How are you seeing firms measure maybe their own internal evolution? Maybe it's adoption, or we're using this component of AI to do work that had previously been lower value, and it's unlocking productivity for higher value work with our consulting team, and or we're using AI to drive this shift to outcome-based pricing, value, and metrics. Any kind of anecdotes in the abstract you want to share, or the good examples from firms that you've encountered doing this?
The measurability on the internal operations has been profound. I was talking with a firm the other day, and they explained how they were deploying, they were using, I think it was a GPT 3.0, and they were using it in ways that they were able to take what used to, it was on their HR and their resource planning side, and developing FAQs for open enrollment, kind of all the things you're doing with HR. And they took what normally would have been about a week's worth of work, and they were able to do it in an hour. And now what I asked, so, what do you do with all that time savings? And they said, well, we get to have lunch now, or, we get to talk about the kids. And actually it was a valid point, because I think anyone who's worked in a consulting firm knows that you're always on the clock, so to speak.
Yeah.
And we talk about utilization being 100% utilized, which is, 100% billable. I think what this is doing is it is freeing up people to be more human, and that's not a bad thing. And I think boutiques especially value that. That's part of their pitch, from a recruiting standpoint, is our culture empathizes and understands that you're a person. So they're making life better, I think, inside the firms. They're also, I mentioned about things, and a lot of firms are doing this, where they're using AI to help craft the proposals and fine-tune deliverables and things like that. It's saving time, and the irony of being in a time-based world is not lost. But at the same time, the time gained allows them to pursue new clients, to talk to their clients about not just the problem at hand, but other ideas they might have. It creates opportunity, I think, is how I would characterize it. And I think at the same time, there's a recognition that while it allows and creates this opportunity and creates time, it's not the solution. It's not the ultimate solution, I should say. And as an example, I talked with someone at this firm who used AI and a coding AI tool to bid on a project, and they ended up basically shorting themselves. It was a 6-week project, when in reality it should have been a 12-week project. And because they were transparent with the client about using AI, the client understood, and they were actually able to sign a work order to extend the contract So it goes back to my original premise, which is AI is a very powerful tool, but just recognize it as a tool. And with your clients, especially, you're transparent about using tools. I think good consultants have always understood that, and I don't think that'll change.
Oh, that's great. And that's a great example, particularly around the idea of giving back a bit of time to that always on tyranny of the now, always on the clock, frenetic pace consulting firm to spend some time on other things than simply, getting work out the door. So, Tom, as always, it's been great chatting with you. Love the examples. Love the idea of the reference back in time to the book, and we should make a note of that. And it's always great digging into these topics with you. If you're interested in seeing how Kantata can help your business operationalize AI and scale your expertise by getting smarter with every engagement, Jackie, my colleague, will be jumping on next to take you through a demo of our new AI-powered sales accelerator. So one manifestation of AI used internally to accelerate your consultancy. But thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you for the next session.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie. Today, I'm going to show you one of Kantata's newest AI capabilities, a tool that helps professional services teams understand profitability, risks, and opportunities before a contract is even signed. For firms working to improve win rates and set clear expectations from the start, Sales Accelerator creates a smoother handoff between sales and delivery. It uses your firm's own delivery history within Kantata to make every proposal more accurate, realistic, and aligned to what your team can actually deliver. Let's take a look at how it works. So with the Sales Accelerator, we're turning your firm's delivery history into your most powerful sales advantage. Right? We're able to hook into your existing tech stack, so any CRM that might be in use, and bring a bit more color and context to those opportunities. Right here, we're essentially looking at a delivery-facing view of our pipeline, and the Sales Accelerator is scoring opportunities based on risk and viability. So for example, this Everest financial opportunity, right? I can see we have a scope risk here. Now, essentially, it's leveraging pattern recognition based on profile data coming in on that opportunity. So things like scope, industry, size, client, right? Really to identify that we've run 12 similar projects over the years in Kantata, which usually take a little over 6 months to deliver. Right? We've only scoped this opportunity at 4 months, which, if everything follows the usual patterns here, will result in a 23% cost overrun. Right? So we can identify why that typically happens and steps that we can take to mitigate those risks. Another example here, this Gravity Devices opportunity, bubbling up a client risk. We've completed 3 projects for this client in the past, and based on sentiment from prior pulse scores, we can identify this client has a pattern of changing scope and delays in task completion. So might need to set better expectations, sort of measure twice, cut once before we move forward. So ultimately being able to weed out opportunities that are doomed from the start, doubling down on the good proven opportunities and catching risks before signature here. Now moving along, right, I can see a new opportunity has come in with Acme Global. And being able to dive in and see all of that data coming in from the CRM, right? We can automatically ingest various documents as well. So I can see in this case, right, we've already conducted a discovery call. And being able to analyze that transcript, right, pulling out the main goals from the client during that call, while also automatically bubbling up similar case studies, right? Client proof points, saying that we have a similar manufacturing client that had similar goals and saw, these various benefits. So surfacing those proof points in real time, again, based on pattern matching. Now, moving down the line, let's say Acme has submitted an RFP, right? Something I know is a big pain point for most services firms. It's time consuming. We often have to pull senior resources off of billable work as they have a lot of the necessary knowledge to assist here. So with the Sales Accelerator, we can quickly generate a draft, and not just a generic response, right? It's taking examples of previous delivered project and kind of stitching those throughout the RFP. So you'll see a lot of that information on the right here. Weaving in things like case studies, recommending the appropriate team we might need for this project, even informing pricing, right? So again, based on all of that delivery history, turning it into more of a repeatable sales advantage. Now, we can also quickly recommend the potential team that will deliver this work, right? Not only will it analyze your resources based on roles and skills, but also taking into account things like prior work history, prior projects, engagements, clients they've worked with, even sharing some anecdotes about your resources and the way they work. So when presenting back to Acme, they'll be able to see exactly why our team is the best fit, not simply just, generic names on a slide. Now, at this point in the sales cycle, right, we're getting close, but maybe they've thrown us one last curveball, right? They want to shift the timelines. They're asking for an additional discount. So we can interact directly with the Sales Accelerator to fully understand the implications of that change. Let's say we want to move it up a week, apply a 10% discount. Now, I can understand from the system that this is doable, but we need to note some trade-offs, right? We're going to take a small hit to the margin, and we also need to move around some of those initial recommended resources, right? So ultimately, for us, winning the business is worth it. So we're going to go ahead and make those changes, but still confident that this will result in a healthy project. So even under pressure, we can negotiate confidently, knowing that delivery won't break. Right now, finally here, once we've reached the point where we've actually won the business and it's time to hand it over to delivery, that sales to services handoff, we know, can often be disjointed and difficult to fully capture everything, right? Resulting in key items that may be missed or overall frustration from the client, right? Having to constantly repeat their needs on both sides. So with the Sales Accelerator, we're able to generate a transition document that's incredibly thorough, right? Compiling all of that data that we've already captured and recorded thus far, really helping identify risks, key stakeholders, requirements that have been discussed during the sales process. So it enables the services team to hit the ground running without the need for weeks of catch-up. So all in all, Sales Accelerator will help stop selling doomed deals from the start, free senior resources up from the proposal grind, build proposals and RFPs with proof points from delivery, and show prospects real talent and results. Thanks again for joining. We look forward to seeing you again in the next session.